Hey everybody, welcome back to the Now the Money podcast. Today we are coming, just Chris and I. Chris, hello, welcome
Hi Ed, how you
back.
doing?
All good, thank you, not too bad. We are doing a not quite high speed, but relatively quickly after the events have unfolded, reaction podcast
Relatively
to what
rapid.
relatively rapid, the RR podcast reaction to what's been happening in the spring statement and what good old Chancellor Reeves has been up to. So lots to digest, and there's obviously a lot going on, even if what she actually announced was fairly limited and it was more of an economic update. But Chris, do you want to give us the bullet on what's going on in the big picture? Because I think you have some quite strong views about that, right?
Yeah, the big. I know you're more of a detail guy. That's probably why this is less rapid reaction. You find all the devils, as they say, in the detail for playing fiscal announcement bingo. But there's a few things that sort of caught my eye, and if I'm a little bit 50-50 on it, and that sort of reflects the uncertainty that a lot of people are feeling around sort of the economic global economic picture at the moment anyway. But one of the things that stood out for me was look, it was supposed to drive growth, right? This was the thing when we did the budget late last year. It needs to be a growth agenda. The UK has had, as you pointed out, nearly 20 years of stagnant growth. There needs to be something where we fix the foundations and then fly off into a brave new world and second half of this century, the mid part of the second half of this century, racing forward. So one of the things that sort of that is, there's not a huge amount of money to be able to do that, to invest in things. Obviously, the point of this spring statement was for Rachel Reeves to restore her headroom. For those who don't know what that is, she's bound her own hands, tied her own hand with her own kind of fiscal rules. And the global picture had changed to such a degree that all of the headroom that she created in the budget for that to happen had been completely wiped out. So this was an attempt to restore all of that with a series of targeted welfare cuts and some other measures that tweaks to government spending and all that kind of stuff that was hopefully going to restore that and mean that we've got a bit more room to play with. So that was kind of the context, really. I think the one thing that caught my eye on the growth agenda was that the OBR had said that Labour are planning to reform the planning reforms when it comes to building property, which we've talked about before in the podcast, Ed, and that is a massively important change. I think this country has not built enough houses for far too long. There's a major shortage and we need to think around the problem. It turns out that they wanted to build 1.5 million homes by the end of the parliament. That's what they announced at the last budget last year. That has been downgraded slightly to 1.3 million. But on the good news, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR to you and I, has predicted that would drive a 0.2% growth in GDP. Now that isn't stellar based on, what we probably need to do to drive Britain into a successful new century. Actually, what it does show to me, or it sort of bears out, is stuff we talked about before in this podcast around fixing the major infrastructure issues that the UK is currently experiencing is probably the path to set us up better for growth. And if you build more houses, you are going to stimulate economic growth. And if you take away the planning issues that make that harder to do and fix infrastructure problems like the lack of housing, and then other issues that we talked about when it comes to railways and all those kind of other things, broadband, all that kind of thing, then you end up, that does seem to be bearing out what the OBR are suggesting, that there's going to be some positive numbers around that. So Starmer's about state intervention in that regard, not too heavy handed, but trying to kind of unblock the issues to growth. I think that's a major thing that kind of defines what this Labour government are trying to achieve. And I think that's probably, in fairness to them, an example of how, if they can get that right, then I think they could be onto a winner with that. I don't know what you think about that, Ed.
Yeah, I think part of the issue that we have here, right, is some of these problems, and particularly with things like the house building and that kind of stuff. These are obviously problems that need to be tackled, and it's laudable that Labour, says it's doing something about that, and the fact that the OBR has actually said, yeah, no, we've marked this, and actually we think it's going to do good stuff for the economy. That's all super laudable. The problem for Labour is that this stuff's going to take 10 years for it to really, anybody to feel any benefit from it, right? Because it takes so long to build stuff anyway. China building a new high-speed railway every 6 months or whatever, mad thing is they do out there. So they're never going to reap the benefit from it, and that's part of the problem with of our political system is that everything's predicated on 5-year cycles. No one cares if you're going to do something that's going to make everybody feel better in 10 years' time because you'll be out of power and long gone, kind of thing. I
I
do
think
also,
that's a good.
yeah.
So I think
Sorry,
that's
go
a
on.
good point. I was struck by how similar it was to George Osborne 10 years ago. I mean, the argument is it wasn't this isn't an austerity measure. It's not a budget anyway. It's a spring statement. It's a fiscal event, right? That's important, I suppose. But it did feel like, haven't we been here before? And why has nothing happened in the intervening 10 years, to your point? I have criticised chancellors at that time for kicking the can down the road and not grasping the nettle and not doing the long-term things that this country needs to do. So I can't sit here and say that, and as you say, it is laudable. I know you know what you're saying, it is laudable. I think they deserve credit for trying to grasp those nettles, I think. The issue for me is that the margins they're working with are so thin. Like there is no money. And although she's kind of restored the fiscal headroom that she set herself, this is all on such a knife edge. As we've seen in the last 6 months, like if the economic picture changes markedly, then all of that could be wiped out again and we're back to square one. So,
Yeah, look,
and actually, sorry, go on.
no, I mean, I think if anybody's really happy, it's George Osborne, right? Because he set up the OBR. He created the entire structure that Labour are now having to work within, that is putting all the limitations on them and forcing Labour to cut welfare spending, and they're increasing defence spending. I mean, this is the most Tory Labour government I've ever seen in my life. Not that I've had that many in my life, fortunately or unfortunately. I shan't comment.
True
But
blue Labour.
we're in a very weird, it's all very topsy-turvy, right? It's all very weird, and this kind of thing. And I think you're right about that kind of, we're shuffling around 5 billion here, 6 billion there. The government spends £1,200 billion a year, to 1.2 trillion pounds. I mean, it's an enormous amount of money that gets spent, and the vast majority of that is being apportioned to things, and the taxes that are bringing most of that money in, not all of it, obviously, because we have to fund it with debt, is stuff that is seen as untouchable. Things like VAT and income tax, etc. Nobody wants to touch it with a barge pole. So that's part of the reason why we're reduced to tinkering around the edges. And then you end up with what are effectively accounting wheezes. So like the moving the international development budget, taking it away from the international development, putting it into defence spending, they're able to earmark, I think it's something like 2 billion of that budget that's been taken out of international development, which is marked as day-to-day spending, which comes under Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules. They're able to reclassify it as investment spending in the defence budget, and then it doesn't matter towards the fiscal rules. So it's just an accounting trick in order to save everybody's blushes for an organisation, the OBR, which is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, but is hamstringing us so badly that we're not able to get anything done properly. It's all just just a mess. It's a finger trap that we're stuck in. I think I've used that analogy
Yeah,
before.
and we need to try and break out of it. And I do go back to the Trump thing. It's hard not to at the moment because the tariff conversation is dominating everything. But if he slaps a 25% tariff between the UK and US on some of the major imports and exports, that just has, how that all plays out on the 2nd of April is going to have probably more of a major effect on whether any economic growth is stimulated and where the global chips fall. And I suppose that's what you could say, which is, I mean, I don't like them ripping up the international order, if I'm being brutally honest, but, it's radical. And your point to kind of break out of I can't believe what I'm saying here, but your point to break out of the finger trap, it does require something radical, I think, but based on the way that not only has the economic situation hemmed Reeves in and the government more broadly, but also the rules they've set upon themselves in order to achieve this stuff means it's hard to kind of think of anything that's going to be anything too revolutionary. But as I pointed to, that growth by investing in the planning reforms over the long term, I think shows the way home. I don't pretend to know the answer about how you free up more funds in order to do that. I don't think it's borrowing more, particularly in the current environment with interest rates as they are. So I think Rachel Reeves is working within very kind of tight confines, and it's
Yeah, look,
a tough one.
and this is where it comes in for anybody who's kind of interested in investing, and for investors
Mm.
as a part of the conversation. The reason why the confines are so tight as well is because the bond market is now a lot more suspicious of everything that the government's doing, and is demanding a much bigger premium to lend money to the government. We had the UK 10-year Treasury yields was sort of ticking up a little bit yesterday, and I think maybe this morning as well. That's the bond market saying, well, we don't absolutely hate it, but we don't love it either. We're not, we're not about to start giving you, debt more cheaply here.
Which is a fair reaction, I think. I think I'd sum my reaction up like that. I don't love it, but I don't hate it. It's like, well,
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
it's like,
Shoulder shrug.
come back in 6 months and let's see what you've got next, kind of thing. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's on
you know,
hold.
it's not a Liz Truss mini budget moment, but we're kind of, everything is so stiflingly tight that, yeah, what do? It's the ultimate ultimate problem. And let's be real as well. Like, I don't think the Tories are going to be in a much better position were they to have continued in power. These problems are bigger than us, and they're coming down the tracks either way. I mean, there's talk of the UK doing a trade deal with Trump and this kind of thing to get us out of any tariff worries, etc. But the bond market's still going to be there, and it's still not going to be that happy. So, let's see what happens. But
Backdrop
it's
of huge increase in defense spending, right? Which is the other thing which we can't shy away from, which is that
yeah.
in the current security environment, that is, I think we'd all agree that makes sense. But that's probably a bill that people weren't thinking we were going to encounter in the near future. And maybe
Well,
that says something, but
yeah, I mean, I tend to get very Tory when I'm talking about things like defence spending, which is not a personal finance topic, I might add, but it does
mm,
add, at the moment when we're talking about macro stuff, it does add into the greater mix. And I mean, for me, it's about thinking about what is the state ultimately responsible for. And I know, obviously, they manage the NHS and, all this, they do the roads and etc. But actually, when you boil down why we have a government, it's to protect people, and actually, it's about that kind of monopoly of violence and
mm.
strength. And the reason we have an army and a navy is because there are other people, countries, call it what you want, out there who want to do nasty things to us. So we have to be able to defend ourselves. That jeopardy is getting worse, so that spending's going to have to go up. And it's also to do with the fact that, I mean, this is completely off topic now, but the kind of the security, the NATO security order of the post Cold War era is collapsed. It is collapsing. You look at those leaked messages that that Atlantic editor was accidentally added into that chat group, and the Trump guys are all almost openly hostile to European security interests. They're a bunch of freeloaders kind of thing. We'll say, well, if you're going to behave like that, then yeah, we're going to have to pay for it ourselves. And whether that means having a agreement with the Europeans, common defence treaties, or whatever it might be, that's the reality. And the fact is that we don't have the luxury of spending on certain things anymore when you have to defend, the country against bad guys or whatever. Sorry,
Yeah,
this is
well, I get your
completely,
point.
this has gone so totally wild, but
No, no, well,
you
your
know,
point about it not being related to personal finances, yeah, fair enough, not directly, but it is directly because that's the reason why there's national insurance increase in for companies that they're going to have to pay. But, that's why those cuts have to come in because that money has to be found somewhere, right? And it's the picture has changed markedly. And Reeves was at pains to point this out, and I do find it kind of weirdly counterintuitive that she stood up there and said nothing has changed. Sorry, everything has changed. Apologies, and cited Trump, cited the changing, worsening security situation and interest rates and all the rest of it, and then rebalanced the books and then said, but the 9.9 billion headroom that I deficit that we're going to be turning around by the end of the parliament is going to be exactly the same. So, really, how's that going to play out then if everything's changed? It's
I
just, oh, we'll
think
just tweak these plans and go from there. It seems a bit of a strange conclusion to draw, but there we go.
I think I mean, part of that comes down to an open realization from the Chancellor, the Treasury, basically everybody involved in the process, including the bondholders, is that going through this process of meeting fiscal rules, no matter what they are, and getting the OBR to mark your homework and say, yes, this is fine, is descended into absurdity because she has to just fudge the numbers in such a way that the OBR signs it off like an accountancy, like an accountancy firm saying, yeah, no, fine, crack on, guys. And it becomes an absurd box ticking exercise where the numbers that you're shuffling around are sort of irrelevant, just as long as you're able to demonstrate to the bond market that you have a bit of headroom, and then everybody can carry on for another 6 months and we don't have to worry. And that seems to be what it's boiling down to, basically, is just making sure that you're not pissing all the wrong people off effectively. And yeah, I mean, maybe that entire system needs fundamental reform, but you know, is any chance they're going to be brave enough to do that when the bond market might have an absolute fit if you try and fundamentally reform the way it's
Well,
done?
ask Liz Truss what Kwasi Kwarteng about that one, and they'll tell you. Ask anyone who's paying for mortgage rates at that point how they feel about that. I mean, yeah, these things have real world impacts, right? It's easy for us to sit here and reimagine the whole thing, but they do have to work within those confines to a degree. But like you said, it's a finger trap. We need to work around it. I don't know the answers, but anyway, hopefully the growth does start to kick in as they predicted as the Parliament moves on, and we start to see Britain moving in the right direction. And as you say, it might take some time, but Ed, what were you being a details guy?
So
What were the things that we can do
yeah,
about it now? How can we, increase
okay.
our own wealth and make better decisions? What's happened?
Well, okay. So the one of my favorite things to do with these spring statements and budgets is listen to give speech and all that kind of thing off, and they pull the rabbits out of the hats, and it's all fun and great or whatever. Actually, the fun bit, and for money, for real money nerds, is to go through all of the documents afterwards. And I'm not as bad as some who will go line by line on all the graphs and
Don't
the
pretend that
charts.
you're not, Ed. I know you are. Come on. Doesn't matter. You're among friends here. That's what the listeners want from you.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Well, okay. So there's a few interesting things that were mentioned in the spring statement documents this time. So and I'll start with one and I'll finish with the other because I want to finish on a high note on the one bit of good news I found inside the spring statement. So the first thing is that we had a little bit more information on what could be happening to ISAs. Now, before the spring statement, there's a lot of speculation that Rachel Reeves might slash the cash ISA allowance. So currently you can put £20,000 in an ISA and basically do with it what you like. You can keep it in cash, you can invest it, whatever. There was a lot of discussion about whether they were going to cut the cash ISA allowance to £4,000. Let's not go into just yet whether that's a good or a bad thing, but what we had in the spring statement documents basically was a commitment from the government to look at reforming the ISA system with a view to establishing whether there is enough retail investment going on and whether it meets the growth criteria that the government has. So what does that tell me? That tells me, yes, they're going to cut the cash ISA allowance. It's probably going to come in the autumn because they're just giving it a bit of space. And then the other thing which I actually found very, very interesting was the bit about encouraging growth, because it's all sort of, and I've written about it in my column today. So anybody who's listening to this want to find out a bit more, please go on the Mouthy Money website, have a read. To me, it sounds like they are introducing the Brit ISA by stealth. Now you've heard of stealth taxes. We all know what a stealth tax is. This is a stealth Brit ISA. Because what the Brit ISA was it was going to be an extra $5,000 on top of your regular ISA allowance that you had to invest in British companies. Everybody panned it. It was, stupid idea because what is a British investment when you can invest in, investment trusts on the FTSE 100 index that are British listed but invest in anything but British stocks and shares or whatever. So it was all a bit of a mess. Labour ditched it as soon as they got into power, pretty much. Now it sounds like we might be getting it back again because they're looking at how they can basically how they can encourage, and by encourage I mean force at the point of a gun, to get people to invest in British goods in assets because they want basically they need more money. They need more money for investments in the UK. So if they can force British people to do that through their ISAs, then great for the government. So yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if you have any strong views on that, but
Yeah, I watched with bated breath. I think we talked about it before about, these reforms seem a bit faulty in the round. So I would really want to see how that would actually work in practice and what investors would do. Forcing people into certain situations, I think, is never a good thing in terms of wealth building. This is what we're here to do, to try and help people build their wealth and be more robust. But, if you can make the case that focusing more on kind of British assets is the right thing to do, then, you might be able to convince a certain cohort of the population.
for what it's worth, I actually agree with the idea that we should have less of the ISA allowance apportioned towards cash, because I do think that once you've got a certain level of cash savings, you don't need to keep putting money into cash ISAs. And I don't care what people like Paul Lewis say about never investing and I've always just had cash ISAs. It's absolute load of nonsense. People over the long term should be investing. Despite the fees and all that kind of stuff, even tracking funds, tend to outperform cash by a wide kind of margin. So actually encouraging more people to be invested, I think is no bad thing. And there's billions and billions of pounds that sits rotting in low interest paying cash accounts. And that's what we need to stamp. It's all well and good if you've got cash and it's in the top rate account paying 5% interest or whatever it is. That's great, you've done well. But the vast majority of people have it sitting in ISAs that have absolutely terrible interest rates, and their money's all devaluing. It's terrible. It's terrible. So I'm not necessarily against that aspect of it, basically.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I think we just got to join the dots and make sure the pipework works and that the case is put to people and there's room for them to make their own minds up about it. I think generally, because it is a bit of an emotive decision. Like we talked about this before, that the stock market can be big and scary to other people or putting your money in, this idea that you're going to be losing money if you invest in the stock market over the long term, historically. And again, past performance is no indication of future performance. We all know that. But, over the long term, the data shows that you're probably better off even if you've just got a little bit of stock market exposure compared to just trying to keep it in cash. And although the inflation numbers that came out yesterday in terms of it returning to below target in 2027 was a bit disappointing, which means those rates might stay a little higher for longer, those interest rates. The general direction of travel is still down, right? And inflation is going to be closer to inflation. So if you want to get better returns on your money, then all eyes are probably point to that. And, but we need to make that case, and we need to make sure people feel comfortable about it and that they know what they're doing, which is why we have these conversations, right?
Yeah. Right. Shall we do the one bit of good news from the spring
Yeah, go on,
statement?
hit us with the good news. Cheer us up,
Aside
Ed. It's
from
been a little bit
aside from
somber.
all the kind of speculation that people are going to be £500 better off in 5 years' time or whatever that ludicrous figure was that she quoted.
Yeah, that was what? How? What? I
Good
might
luck
blow
with
all of
that.
that on holiday. I don't know. There we go.
No, so there is a tangible bit of good news that I have to
Okay.
share, and I'm going to finishing the podcast off with. They obviously, so a big part of what the government is doing is there a whole bunch of measures basically cracking down on tax avoiders and non-payers. So the tax gap is something huge. It's like 40 billion quid or something there, and huge amounts of money that's owed to the Treasury, and they're trying to recoup more of that, and they're introducing new powers basically to tackle this, which is fine. Whatever. I'm not going to go into the detail. There's one which I thought was interesting, which affects kind of, regular people. Anyone who files a self-assessment tax return now. So they're increasing the penalties on people who file their self-assessments late. And I'm afraid, frankly, I have very little sympathy for people who file their tax returns late.
I bet yours is ready as soon as they send the first email reminder, Ed. Is that right?
I haven't done one in a while,
Well,
to be
easy
honest.
for you to say then. You haven't had to slave over it like some of these other
Yeah.
poor people. Anyway.
PAYE king right here. No. So what they're doing is they're hiking the penalties. So if up to 15 days late, over 15 days late for your self-assessment return, and you get 3% penalty of the entire tax you owe, basically added on. If it's over 31 days, they're hiking the penalty from 4% of the tax owed to 10% of the tax owed. So that's a big
Hefty.
hike if you're over a month late, basically. Now, that's not the bit of good news,
I was
but
going to
I
say that doesn't
think
sound good.
it's not. It's only good if you want people to ensure that they do their self-assessments on time, Chris. That's all I'm going to say on that matter. The one bit of good news is it's such a small it's not, it's a fairly small demographic, but technically speaking, I think probably growing. Anybody who's subject to the high income child benefit charge. So who does that affect? Parents who are in receipt of child benefit, who earn over £60,000 a year, are basically to having, up until about £80,000 now, I think it is, subject to having some of their child benefit clawed back through the tax system. Now, the annoying thing about this is if you earn 70 grand a year, you're entitled to some child benefit, but you have to pay roughly half of that back. So because you have to pay roughly half of that back, which is only about £600 a year in tax, you have to do a self-assessment tax return. So you have to go through the entire process just to pay a relatively modest amount of the child benefit back. Here's the good news, Chris. The good news is the government is changing how people who are subject to the high income child benefit charge pay their tax back. From the summer, you will be able to register digitally with the government's system, and you can pay the tax back through the PAYE system instead of having to do a self-assessment. So for anybody on an income between about £60,000 and £80,000 with a child, and you are in receipt of child benefit, the good news is you will no longer have to file a self-assessment tax return. So assuming if you're a full-time employee. If you're not, you still have to do it. And that's it. That's the good news.
Slim pickings. Hurrah! There we go. You get an afternoon back,
I
everybody.
shall be raising a glass to Rachel Reeves tonight on the back of that.
It's well, good, Ed. I was glad you're a positive soul.
Score one for simplicity in the tax system, Chris. That's all I want at the end of
There
the
you
day.
go.
A simple, fair tax system.
This is
Please
the
and
thin
thank
end of
you.
the wedge. This is the thin end of the wedge. It's all changes
Yeah.
are coming, and this is where the dam bursts. There you
Next
go.
stop is the tax cliff edges. That this is a slippery slope in the right direction.
There we go. Great.
And that is
Okay. Well,
all I should say about that.
I didn't think tax self-assessments would leave me feeling buoyed, but there we go. Upbeat as we roll into the rest
You
of this
gotta
day.
end on a positive note, Chris.
Well,
We've
true.
got to
And
give.
you found one. Well, fair play to you. You found one. There you go.
Right. So that's about it. I mean, obviously, anybody listening who's got any views on the spring statement, do get in touch and let us know. We're very interested to hear. We've got lots coming up on the podcast in the next few weeks. Some really interesting guests coming up, which, yeah, please do give us a like and subscribe and follow us for more. Chris, thank you as ever.
My pleasure, Ed. My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. We will obviously see you again soon. And goodbye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube. You can also follow all our latest updates on TikTok, Instagram, or X. Finally, check out all our money stories on the Mouthy Money website and subscribe to our weekly newsletter for all the latest straight to your inbox. Thank you and goodbye.